And one of the purposes that we want to serve this evening is to review some of that story and set the recent events in context. And to do that, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Sam Pari, who is a spokesperson for the Tamil community here in Sydney. And if you want to come up, Sam, she's going to tell us a bit more about the history of the conflict and the context in which we could see the recent events. Sam.
I've been given the very difficult task of shrinking down 61 years of human rights abuses in Sri Lanka down to 10 minutes. So if I go over time, please do excuse me. Since the surfacing of the Channel 4 video, which you all just saw, several human rights organizations have spoken out and called for an independent inquiry into possible war crimes in Sri Lanka. Human Rights Watch has frequently accused both the Sri Lankan government as well as the Tamil Tigers of war crimes, as have other human rights organizations. The United Nations Special Rapporteur not only called for an independent inquiry after the surfacing of this video, but also pointed out that he had asked permission to visit Sri Lanka on several occasions in the recent past few years, but had been refused repeatedly by the Sri Lankan government. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillai, has also called for independent investigations into possible war crimes repeatedly over the last several weeks to months. And again, the Sri Lankan government has refused to allow independent inquiries into crimes against humanity. So as you would have heard in that video, the Sri Lankan government categorically denied that the Sri Lankan armed forces or personnel from the Sri Lankan government had anything to do with that video. This denial is not something new to the Sri Lankan government. Furthermore, such evidence showing human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, is also not new to the Sri Lankan government. Over the last several months, and in fact several years, evidence has surfaced showing that the Sri Lankan government is complicit in war crimes. For example, a leaked United Nations document in May said that 20,000 Tamil civilians were killed in the recent military onslaught. Again, the Sri Lankan government denied this, but what was worrying was Minister Mahinda Samarasinghe, on the 18th of May, a day before the Sri Lankan government claimed it had won the war against the Tamil Tigers, said, "All Tamil civilians have been rescued without shedding a drop of blood." Now, who is this minister? He's the Sri Lankan Minister for Disaster Management and Human Rights. So this statement was made days before a United Nations leaked document said that a minimum of 20,000 Tamil civilians may have died because of the Sri Lankan government's military onslaught. Several hospitals and civilian targets within a safe zone declared by the Sri Lankan government were bombed by the Sri Lankan military. This is not just an allegation made by aid agencies and the Tamil people, but also Human Rights Watch, who have documented 30 hospitals that have been bombed by aerial bombing and shelling by the Sri Lankan government. Again, the Sri Lankan government denied this repeatedly. However, in an interview to Sky News by Defence Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is also, by the way, the brother of the current president, he defends the Sri Lankan military's artillery shelling of a civilian hospital where 12 civilians were killed, and he says, "No hospital should operate outside the safety zone. Everything beyond the safety zone is a legitimate target." So whilst defending the government's decision to bomb this hospital, he in fact has accepted that bombing did take place of civilian targets, of hospitals, in and outside the safety zone. Chemical weapons, cluster bombs, and white phosphorus were used by the Sri Lankan military on civilian targets. These are all against international humanitarian law and against the laws of war. And again, although the Sri Lankan government denied this repeatedly, Associated French press released an article where a French field hospital, doctors from a French field hospital had said that some of the wounds that they were treating on the civilians were possibly caused by burns from phosphorus. And as I stated before, this is against international humanitarian law. Heavy weapons were used by the Sri Lankan military on civilian targets, and Amnesty International has written several reports about this. And once again, although the Sri Lankan government denied this, satellite images released by American Association for Advancement of Science has shown aerial images of craters that could have only been caused by aerial bombardment and shelling, which only the Sri Lankan government was capable of doing at that time. And again, these craters were in civilian areas in the zone that the Sri Lankan government had unilaterally declared as a safety zone, as a no-fire safety zone. And aid agencies, the Red Cross, United Nations agencies, and independent media were denied access to civilians in the conflict zone throughout the last several months. So my question is, if there's no war crimes going on, if there's nothing that the Sri Lankan government has to worry about, then what is there to hide? Why not allow independent witnesses into this area? What we saw on the video and what I've mentioned to you over the last couple of minutes is not something new to Sri Lanka. It's not a recent deterioration in the human rights record of Sri Lanka, nor is it something unique to the current government. There is a history of systematic discrimination of the Tamil people and other minorities by successive Sri Lankan governments. And I will go through the history of what led to the current human rights emergency in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is a small island situated to the south of India. There are two main languages, Tamil, spoken by the majority of people along the north and east of the island, and Sinhala, spoken by the people who inhabit the central and southwestern regions of the island. Before European colonization, there were three kingdoms, two Sinhalese kingdoms, coloured in red and orange, and one Tamil kingdom coloured in green on this map. Now, although the Sri Lankan government and other supporters of the Sri Lankan government claim that these three kingdoms did not exist, there is very strong evidence that these three kingdoms existed and the Tamils and the Sinhalese lived separately. For example, in June 1979, a letter written by Sir Cleghorn, who was the first British colonial secretary, a letter written to the British government by him states, two different nations from a very ancient period have divided between them the possession of the island. First, the Sinhalese, inhabiting the interior of the country in its southern and western parts, and secondly, the Malabars or the Tamils, who possess the northern and eastern districts. These two nations differ entirely in their religion, language, and manners. So in 1505, the Portuguese invaded the island and ruled it. In 1658, the Dutch invaded and ruled. And in 1796, the British took control. Now, each kingdom fell at different times to each of these colonizers. And although the Dutch and the Portuguese ruled the different kingdoms separately while they colonized the island, when the British came and took control, in 1833, they actually merged all the kingdoms together for easy administration. And in 1948, when the British left Sri Lanka, instead of leaving it the way they found it, they handed over political power to the majority, who were the Sinhalese. Post-independence was when we saw the systematic discrimination begin. There was the Citizenship Act of 1948, where 1 million Tamils had their citizenship removed. Basically, that meant they had no voting rights. This was 1/3 of the Tamils in the island had their citizenship removed overnight. And the reason for this was these Tamils were of Indian origin. The British had brought a large number of Tamils from India to Sri Lanka to work in the tea plantations. However, these Tamils had lived there for generations before the Citizenship Act was brought in. You know, I look around this room and I see a lot of people with different skin colours, different eye colours. You obviously have come from other countries, and what this Citizenship Act did was to say that because you are of Indian origin, it doesn't matter if you've been here for 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, you were not born in Sri Lanka, your ancestors are not from Sri Lanka, hence you do not have a say in the way Sri Lanka runs the country. In 1948, the Sinhalese colonization of the traditional Tamil homelands began, and the most significant demographic change took place in the east. So you had the government encouraging Sinhalese civilians to buy land, or rather you had the government colonizing Tamil homelands of the north and east and placing Sinhalese people there. And this further jeopardized the political power that the Tamils in the east had, because it diluted their population, and hence the little chance that they had of voting Tamil politicians into parliament was also decreased. In